The morning of September 14, 1983, dawned crisp and golden over the rolling hills of Willowbrook Springs, Tennessee. The small town, nestled between ancient oak trees and meandering streams, seemed to hold its breath in the early autumn air. At the heart of the community stood Cornerstone Baptist Church, its white steeple reaching toward heaven like a prayer made manifest in wood and faith. Reverend Matthew Thomas Hawthorne stood in his study, adjusting his tie one final time before the Wednesday evening service. At 42 years old, Matthew possessed the kind of gentle strength that drew people to him like moths to a flame. His graying temples spoke of wisdom earned through years of shepherding souls, while his warm brown eyes reflected a depth of compassion that had comforted countless hearts in times of sorrow. "Matthew, dear, are you ready?" called his wife, Eleanor Grace Hawthorne, from the kitchen of their modest parsonage. Her voice carried the musical quality that had first captured his heart when they met at seminary 20 years earlier. Eleanor, at 39, remained as beautiful as the day he proposed beneath the willow tree that gave their town its name. "Almost, my love," Matthew replied, reaching for his worn leather Bible. The book had been his father's, and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Hawthorne men had preached from its pages. As his fingers traced the familiar cover, Matthew felt the weight of legacy and calling settling on his shoulders like an invisible mantle. He paused at his desk, where a half-written sermon lay scattered in handwritten notes. The message was to be about faith in dark times, drawing from Job's steadfast trust in God despite unimaginable suffering. Matthew had been wrestling with the sermon all week, feeling an unusual urgency to communicate something profound to his congregation, though he couldn't quite articulate what that something was. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair catching the lamplight. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her kind green eyes, and Matthew marveled, as he did every day, at the grace God had shown him in giving him such a woman. "You seem troubled tonight," she observed, moving to straighten his collar with practiced tenderness. "Is everything all right with the sermon?" Matthew covered her hands with his own, drawing comfort from her touch. "I feel called to say something tonight, Eleanor. Something important. But I'm not certain what God wants me to convey." "Then trust Him to give you the words when you need them," she said, rising on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek. "He always has before." Their children, Sarah Elizabeth and David Matthew, ages 16 and 14 respectively, were already at the church helping to prepare for the evening service. Sarah, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's thoughtful nature, served as the church pianist despite her young age. David, tall for his age and eager to follow in his father's footsteps, helped arrange chairs and greet congregants with the enthusiasm of youth. As Matthew and Eleanor walked the short path from the parsonage to the church, neither could have imagined that it would be the last time they would walk together as a complete family. The evening air carried the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. Cornerstone Baptist Church had served the community of Willowbrook Springs for over 100 years. The building itself told stories, of revivals that had swept through the town like holy fire, of weddings celebrated and lives mourned, of children dedicated and believers baptized in the nearby creek. The sanctuary could hold about 200 people, though on this particular Wednesday evening, perhaps 75 souls had gathered for fellowship and worship. Matthew greeted each person by name as they entered, inquiring about grandchildren, job situations, and health concerns with genuine interest. To him, these weren't merely church members, they were family, entrusted to his care by the shepherd of their souls. "Evening, Pastor Hawthorne," called out James Robert Caldwell, the church's head deacon and owner of Caldwell's hardware store. At 55, James possessed the robust build of a man who had worked with his hands his entire life. His wife, Patricia Ann Caldwell, taught Sunday school and organized the church's benevolence ministry. "Good evening, James, Patricia," Matthew replied warmly. "How's your mother feeling after her surgery?" "Much better, thanks to your visits and prayers," Patricia responded, squeezing Matthew's hand gratefully. "She asks about you every time we visit." As the service began, Sarah's delicate fingers danced across the piano keys, filling the sanctuary with the beloved hymn, "How Great Thou Art." The congregation's voices joined in harmony, creating a sound that seemed to lift the very rafters toward heaven. Matthew sat in his chair behind the pulpit, listening to the voices of his flock and feeling an overwhelming sense of love for these people who had become his life's work. When time came for the sermon, Matthew rose and approached the pulpit with his Bible in hand. As he looked out over the familiar faces, farmers and shopkeepers, teachers and retirees, young mothers with sleeping babies and elderly couples who had weathered decades together, he felt that familiar stirring in his spirit that told him God was about to speak through him. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the sanctuary, "tonight I want to speak to you about the mystery of God's timing. We live in a world that demands immediate answers, instant solutions, and quick fixes. But God's ways are not our ways, and His timing is not our timing." Matthew opened his Bible to the book of Ecclesiastes, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. Solomon wrote, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." Sometimes we must wait for God's purposes to unfold, even when that waiting feels unbearable. Eleanor watched her husband from the front pew, noting the passionate intensity with which he spoke. There was something different about Matthew tonight, an urgency, almost as if he were trying to convey a lifetime of ministry in a single sermon. "There may come times in our lives," Matthew continued, "when God calls us to trust Him even when we cannot see the path ahead. Even when circumstances seem to make no sense. Even when it feels as though He has abandoned us in our darkest hour." The congregation listened with rapt attention. Several people nodded in recognition, having faced their own dark valleys where faith was their only compass. "I want you to remember," Matthew's voice grew softer, more intimate, "that God is always working, even when we cannot see His hand. Truth has a way of emerging from the darkness, no matter how long it has been buried. Justice delayed is not justice denied when God is the judge." After the service concluded with a final hymn and benediction, the congregation filed out slowly, many stopping to shake Matthew's hand and thank him for the message. It was nearly 9:30 p.m. when the last parishioner departed, leaving only the Hawthorne family to lock up the church. "That was a powerful message tonight, Dad," David said as they gathered the hymnals and straightened the pews. "Thank you, son," Matthew replied, though his expression remained thoughtful. "I pray it was what God wanted them to hear." As they prepared to leave, Matthew hesitated at the pulpit. "Eleanor, would you and the children go ahead? I'd like to spend a few more minutes in prayer." Eleanor studied her husband's face with growing concern. "Are you certain everything is all right, Matthew?" He pulled her close, holding her tighter than usual. "I love you, Eleanor. Please never forget that. And know that whatever may come, God is in control." The intensity of his words sent a chill through Eleanor's heart, but she had learned over 20 years of marriage to trust her husband's spiritual sensitivity. "I love you too, Matthew. Don't be too long." After his family departed for the parsonage, Matthew knelt at the altar where he had knelt countless times before. The sanctuary was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the distant sound of wind stirring the trees outside. "Lord," he whispered, his hands clasped tightly together, "I don't understand what you're asking of me, but I trust you. If this is truly your will, then give me the strength to walk the path you've set before me. Watch over Eleanor and the children. Let them know that I love them beyond words." Matthew remained in prayer for nearly an hour, wrestling with God like Jacob at the brook Jabbok. When he finally rose, his face was wet with tears, but his expression held a peaceful resolution that spoke of surrender to divine will. Before leaving the sanctuary, Matthew walked to a small room behind the pulpit where the church stored communion supplies and historical records. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew a sealed envelope that bore the words, "To be opened only when truth must come to light," in his careful handwriting. He placed the envelope carefully behind a loose board in the wall, a hiding place he had discovered during routine maintenance months earlier. "Father," he whispered as he concealed the envelope, "let this remain hidden until the time is right. You know all things, and you see the end from the beginning. I trust in your perfect timing." Matthew locked the church and began walking toward the parsonage, but instead of taking the direct path, he turned toward the old creek that ran behind the property. It was here, in this peaceful spot beneath the willow trees, that he had proposed to Eleanor so many years ago. It was here that he often came to seek God's face when the weight of ministry grew heavy. The next morning, Eleanor awakened to find Matthew's side of the bed cold and empty. At first, she assumed he had risen early for his morning devotions, as was his custom. But when she went to the kitchen to start breakfast, she found no evidence that he had been there. His coffee cup sat unused in the cabinet, his Bible remained on the nightstand where he always left it after his evening reading. "Sarah! David!" Eleanor called, her voice carrying a note of concern. "Have either of you seen your father this morning?" Both children appeared in the kitchen, still in their pajamas and rubbing sleep from their eyes. "Isn't he in his study?" Sarah asked, noting the worried expression on her mother's face. Eleanor hurried to Matthew's study, her heart beginning to race. The room was exactly as he had left it the night before, sermon notes still scattered on the desk, books open to passages he had been researching. But Matthew was nowhere to be found. By noon, when Matthew failed to appear for his scheduled hospital visits, Eleanor knew something was terribly wrong. Matthew Hawthorne had never missed an appointment in 15 years of ministry at Cornerstone Baptist Church. She called James Caldwell, who immediately organized a search party of church members and townspeople. "Pastor Hawthorne," voices called through the woods surrounding Willowbrook Springs. "Matthew." The search continued through the afternoon and into the evening, but no trace of the beloved pastor could be found. Sheriff William Henry Torres, a weathered man of 58 who had known Matthew since his arrival in Willowbrook Springs, took the disappearance seriously from the beginning. Sheriff Torres had served the community for over 30 years and had developed an instinct for trouble. Matthew's disappearance felt wrong in ways that the sheriff couldn't articulate but deeply sensed. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Sheriff Torres said gently as he sat in the parsonage living room that evening, "I need to ask you some difficult questions. Was your husband experiencing any unusual stress? Any problems with church members? Financial difficulties?" Eleanor shook her head emphatically. "Nothing like that, Sheriff. Matthew loved his work here. The congregation loved him. Our finances are modest but stable." She paused, remembering the intensity of Matthew's farewell the night before. "But he did seem different last night. More serious than usual. As if he were carrying a burden he couldn't share." The investigation revealed no signs of foul play, no evidence of an accident, no indication that Matthew had planned to leave voluntarily. His car remained in the parsonage driveway. His wallet, containing $43 and his driver's license, was found on his dresser. Most telling of all, his wedding ring sat on the nightstand beside his Bible, something Matthew would never have removed willingly. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The people of Willowbrook Springs rallied around the Hawthorne family with unprecedented support, but the mystery of Matthew's disappearance remained unsolved. Some theorized that he had suffered a medical emergency while walking in the woods and his body simply hadn't been found. Others whispered about more sinister possibilities, though no one could imagine who would want to harm the gentle pastor. Eleanor refused to give up hope, even as autumn turned to winter and winter gave way to spring. She remained in the parsonage with Sarah and David, supported by the congregation and sustained by a faith that had been forged in the fires of uncertainty. The seasons changed in Willowbrook Springs, but for Eleanor Hawthorne and her children, time seemed suspended in the amber of loss and unanswered questions. Christmas of 1983 came and went without Matthew's joyful presence filling their home with carols and laughter. The new year arrived like an unwelcome guest, marking the passage of time without bringing the return they all prayed for each night. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window on a cold January morning, watching the bare branches of the old oak tree scratch against the gray sky. For months had passed since Matthew's disappearance, and while the initial shock had given way to a numb acceptance of their new reality, the pain remained as fresh as the first day. "Mom." Sarah's voice broke through Eleanor's reverie. At 16, Sarah had aged years in just a few months, her youthful innocence replaced by a premature understanding of life's fragility. "The church board is here to see you." Eleanor smoothed her dress and walked to the living room, where James Caldwell sat with two other church elders, Thomas Franklin Whitfield, a retired schoolteacher with kind gray eyes, and Dr. Robert Charles Brennan, the town's physician and a man whose faith had been tested in the crucible of human suffering. "Eleanor," James began carefully, "we've been praying about the future of Cornerstone Baptist Church. It's been 4 months since Matthew." He paused, unable to speak the word "disappeared" in front of Matthew's wife. "Since Matthew has been gone. The congregation needs pastoral leadership." Eleanor nodded, understanding the difficult position the church found itself in. "I know you do, James. Matthew would want the ministry to continue." Dr. Brennan leaned forward, his expression gentle but grave. "We've been in contact with the Regional Baptist Association. They're willing to send an interim pastor to help us through this transition period. But that would mean—" He hesitated, glancing at his fellow elders for support. "That would mean we would need the parsonage for the new pastor's family," Thomas finished quietly. "We don't want to ask you to leave your home, Eleanor, especially not under these circumstances. But the church only has the one parsonage." Eleanor had been expecting this conversation for weeks. She understood the practical necessities, even as her heart broke at the thought of leaving the home where she and Matthew had built their life together. "When would you need us to move?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "Not until you've had time to make arrangements," James assured her quickly. "The association isn't sending anyone until March. That gives you 2 months to decide what you'd like to do." After the elders left, Eleanor sat in Matthew's study, surrounded by his books and sermon notes. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne, and his favorite coffee mug sat on the desk exactly where he had left it that last morning. Sarah and David found her there an hour later, staring at the wall as if it might reveal the secrets of their father's fate. "What did they want, Mom?" David asked, though at 14, he was perceptive enough to guess. Eleanor gathered her children close, drawing strength from their presence. "They need the parsonage for a new pastor, which means we'll need to find somewhere else to live." "Are we leaving Willowbrook Springs?" Sarah asked, fear creeping into her voice. This town, this church, these people were all they had ever known. "I don't know yet, darling," Eleanor admitted. "I need to pray about it. Your father always said that God would provide for our needs, and I have to trust that He will continue to do so, even now." The next few weeks were filled with difficult decisions and painful preparations. Eleanor sorted through Matthew's belongings, carefully packing his books and papers in boxes that would be stored in the church's basement. She found notebooks filled with sermon ideas, letters from parishioners thanking Matthew for his counsel, and photographs of church events spanning 15 years of ministry. In the deepest drawer of his desk, Eleanor discovered something that made her pause, a journal that Matthew had kept during the months leading up to his disappearance. The entries were sporadic and brief, but they revealed a man wrestling with something that had been weighing heavily on his heart. August 15, 1983, prayed for wisdom today regarding the situation with the Miller family. "Some burdens are too heavy for a pastor to carry alone, but confidentiality prevents me from seeking counsel. Lord, give me strength to do what is right." August 28, 1983, the truth has a way of surfacing, even when people work hard to keep it buried. I'm reminded of Jesus' words, "Nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light." September 7, 1983, feel called to prepare my heart for something difficult. Don't understand what God is asking, but I sense a great testing coming. Like Job, I must trust that the Lord gives and takes away, and blessed be His name. September 13, 1983, tomorrow I will preach about God's timing and the certainty that truth will emerge from darkness. Pray this message will serve God's purposes, even if I cannot see how. Committed my way unto the Lord. Eleanor read the entries 3 times, her heart aching as she tried to decipher what burden Matthew had been carrying. Who were the Millers mentioned in the first entry? She couldn't recall any family by that name in their congregation, though it was possible Matthew had been counseling someone from outside the church. She took the journal to Sheriff Torres, hoping it might provide new clues about Matthew's disappearance. The sheriff read through the entries carefully, his weathered face growing more troubled with each page. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said finally, "these entries suggest your husband was dealing with some kind of moral or ethical dilemma in the weeks before he disappeared. The references to truth being hidden and confidentiality preventing him from seeking counsel sound like he might have learned something that put him in a difficult position." "But what could that have been?" Eleanor asked. "Matthew never mentioned any serious problems in the church or community." Sheriff Torres closed the journal thoughtfully. "Sometimes pastors become aware of situations that others would prefer to keep quiet. Your husband was the kind of man people trusted with their deepest secrets. It's possible he learned something that someone didn't want revealed." The implications of the sheriff's words sent a chill through Eleanor's heart. Could Matthew's disappearance have been connected to some secret he had discovered? The thought that someone in their peaceful community might have harmed her husband was almost too terrible to contemplate. As February progressed, Eleanor made the difficult decision to remain in Willowbrook Springs. The church members had rallied around the family, offering financial support and practical assistance. Mrs. Catherine Louise Henderson, a wealthy widow who owned several rental properties in town, offered Eleanor and the children a small but comfortable house on Maple Street at a rent they could afford. "Matthew married my husband and me 43 years ago," Mrs. Henderson explained as she showed Eleanor through the 3-bedroom house. "He baptized our children and buried my dear Henry 5 years ago. It would be my honor to provide a home for his family." The house on Maple Street was cozy and well-maintained, with a small garden in the back and a front porch that caught the afternoon sun. It would be a significant adjustment after 15 years in the parsonage, but Eleanor could envision making it a home for her children. Moving day in early March was bittersweet. Members of Cornerstone Baptist Church arrived with trucks and strong backs, carefully transporting the Hawthorne family's belongings to their new address. Eleanor was touched by the tenderness with which these people handled Matthew's books and papers, treating each item as a sacred trust. The interim pastor, Reverend Daniel Scott Peterson, arrived from Nashville the week after the Hawthornes moved out. He was a kind man in his 50s who understood the delicate nature of his position. Rather than trying to replace Matthew, he focused on providing stability and comfort to a congregation still grieving their beloved pastor's mysterious disappearance. "I'm not here to take Pastor Hawthorne's place," Reverend Peterson told the congregation on his first Sunday. "No one could do that. I'm simply here to serve you faithfully until God provides more permanent leadership." Eleanor attended that first service with Sarah and David, sitting in the same pew where she had worshipped for 15 years. It felt strange to see another man in Matthew's pulpit, but she was grateful for Reverend Peterson's sensitivity and the gentle way he acknowledged the congregation's loss. As spring turned to summer, life in Willowbrook Springs began to establish a new rhythm. Sarah graduated from high school with honors and received a scholarship to attend Carson Newman College, where she planned to study music education. David threw himself into his studies and his part-time job at Caldwell's hardware store, determined to help support the family however he could. Eleanor found work as a secretary at Willowbrook Springs Elementary School, where her gentle manner and natural compassion made her invaluable to both staff and students. The work provided not only needed income but also a sense of purpose during the long hours when the silence of Matthew's absence threatened to overwhelm her. But despite the semblance of normalcy that gradually returned to their lives, the mystery of Matthew's disappearance remained an open wound in the heart of the community. Sheriff Torres continued to follow up on occasional tips and leads, but as months turned into years, the case grew cold. Some people theorized that Matthew had suffered amnesia after an accident and was living somewhere under a different identity. Others whispered about more sinister possibilities, suggesting that Matthew had been murdered and his body hidden where it would never be found. Still others clung to the hope that he had simply felt called to some special mission and would return when God's purpose was fulfilled. Eleanor refused to give up hope entirely, though as years passed, that hope became tempered with acceptance. She kept Matthew's wedding ring in a small jewelry box on her dresser, and every night before sleep, she would hold it and pray for peace, both for Matthew, wherever he might be, and for her own aching heart. The children adjusted to life without their father with the resilience of youth, but the loss shaped them in profound ways. Sarah's music became more poignant, infused with a depth of emotion that spoke of sorrow transformed into beauty. David's faith, rather than being shaken by his father's disappearance, seemed to deepen, as if he were determined to honor Matthew's legacy by maintaining an unwavering trust in God's sovereignty. As the years passed, Reverend Peterson was replaced by a permanent pastor, Reverend Michael James Harrison, a young seminary graduate who brought energy and fresh vision to Cornerstone Baptist Church. Eleanor liked the new pastor and his wife, though she sometimes found it painful to watch them build their life in the parsonage where she and Matthew had been so happy. By 1990, 7 years after Matthew's disappearance, life in Willowbrook Springs had settled into a rhythm that accommodated the mystery at its heart. Children who had been born after 1983 grew up hearing whispered stories about the pastor who had vanished like morning mist, becoming part of the town's folklore. Newcomers to the community learned about Matthew Hawthorne's disappearance as part of their initiation into Willowbrook Springs history. Eleanor remained active in Cornerstone Baptist Church, serving as the church pianist after Sarah left for college and eventually marriage. Her faith, tested by fire and refined by suffering, became a source of strength for others facing their own trials. People often sought her counsel, knowing that she understood the weight of unanswered prayers and the challenge of trusting God when his plan seemed incomprehensible. On the 10th anniversary of Matthew's disappearance, the church held a special memorial service. Reverend Harrison spoke about faith that endures beyond understanding, and the congregation sang Matthew's favorite hymns. Eleanor stood and shared a brief testimony that moved many to tears. Matthew always taught that God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our desires, she said, her voice strong and clear. I don't understand why he was taken from us, but I choose to believe that his life and ministry had meaning that extends beyond our comprehension. Somewhere, somehow, the seeds he planted are still bearing fruit. As the memorial service concluded, Eleanor felt a sense of closure that had eluded her for a decade. She would never stop loving Matthew or missing him, but she had learned to carry that love as a gift rather than a burden. Little did she know that in just 13 more years, a discovery would be made that would finally answer the questions that had haunted Willowbrook Springs for nearly a quarter century. The truth that Matthew had spoken about in his final sermon, the truth that emerges from darkness no matter how long it has been buried, was waiting patiently for its appointed time to come to light. The summer of 2023 arrived in Willowbrook Springs with the kind of golden warmth that made the Tennessee hills shimmer like a scene from a painting. 40 years had passed since Pastor Matthew Hawthorne's mysterious disappearance, and while the story remained part of the town's collective memory, daily life had long since moved beyond the immediate pain of that loss. Eleanor Hawthorne, now 79 years old, had become something of a living legend in Willowbrook Springs. Her silver hair and gentle smile were familiar sights at Cornerstone Baptist Church, where she still played piano for Sunday services despite her age. Sarah and David, now in their 50s with families of their own, visited regularly, bringing grandchildren who called her Grandmama Eleanor and listened with wide eyes to stories about the grandfather they had never met. The current pastor of Cornerstone Baptist Church was Reverend Jonathan David Carmichael, a thoughtful man in his early 40s who had led the congregation for 8 years. Under his leadership, the church had grown significantly, drawing families from throughout the county who were attracted to his expository preaching and the church's strong sense of community. Mrs. Hawthorne, Pastor Carmichael said one Sunday morning after service, the building committee has approved the renovation project we discussed. We'll be updating the sanctuary to accommodate our growing congregation, but I want to assure you that we'll preserve the historical character that makes this place so special. Eleanor smiled, touched by his consideration. I'm sure Matthew would be pleased to see the church growing and thriving, Pastor Carmichael. Change is part of life, and buildings should serve the people, not the other way around. The renovation project was ambitious, involving the expansion of the sanctuary, the addition of a new fellowship hall, and updates to the church's aging infrastructure. Harrison Brothers Construction, a local company run by twin brothers Marcus and Luke Harrison, had been hired to oversee the work. Marcus Harrison, the older twin by 12 minutes, served as the project foreman. At 45, he possessed the weathered hands of a craftsman and the methodical mind of someone who understood that good construction required patience and attention to detail. His brother Luke handled the business side of their operation but was equally skilled with tools when needed. "This building has good bones," Marcus told Pastor Carmichael as they walked through the sanctuary on the Monday morning when work was scheduled to begin. The original construction from the 1880s was solid, and the renovations over the years have been done thoughtfully. "We'll treat her with the respect she deserves." The renovation began with the installation of additional electrical circuits to support modern lighting and sound systems. This required accessing wall cavities and crawl spaces that hadn't been disturbed in decades. As Marcus and his crew carefully removed sections of wainscoting and examined the building's infrastructure, they uncovered layers of history, old newspapers used as insulation, children's drawings that had been slipped behind loose boards, and artifacts from previous renovation projects. "Pastor," Marcus called out on Wednesday afternoon of the first week, "you might want to come see this. We found something interesting in the wall behind the pulpit." Pastor Carmichael made his way to where Marcus stood near the sanctuary's eastern wall, holding a flashlight and wearing a puzzled expression. "What is it, Marcus?" "There's a cavity back here that doesn't match the building plans," Marcus explained, shining his light into a gap between the walls. "It's not part of the original construction, and it's not mentioned in any of the renovation records from the church files. Someone created this space deliberately, and recently enough that the wood shows saw marks from modern tools." Pastor Carmichael peered into the cavity, noting the careful way it had been constructed. Could it have been for storage? Maybe someone needed to hide church documents during wartime or economic hardship. Possibly, Marcus agreed, but the construction technique suggests this was done sometime in the 1980s, based on the type of screws and lumber used. "And there's something else, I can see what looks like a package wrapped in plastic back in the deepest part of the cavity." The discovery of a hidden package in the church wall created an immediate stir among the renovation crew and church staff. Pastor Carmichael called Eleanor Hawthorne, knowing that her memory of the church's history was unmatched by anyone in the congregation. Eleanor arrived within 30 minutes, accompanied by her son David, now 54, and serving as a deacon at Cornerstone Baptist Church. David had inherited his father's thoughtful nature and possessed an engineer's practical approach to problem-solving that complemented his deep faith. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Marcus explained the situation as they gathered around the wall cavity, "this space was created sometime in the early 1980s, based on the materials and construction methods. Do you remember any renovation projects from that time period that might explain it?" Eleanor studied the opening carefully, her mind reaching back across 4 decades of church history. "The early 1980s. She murmured, then her eyes widened with recognition. "There was work done in 1984, about 6 months after Matthew disappeared. The church hired someone to install new wiring for the sound system. I remember because it was one of the first major projects approved after that terrible time." David frowned, his engineering mind immediately grasping the implications. "Mom, if this cavity was created in 1984, 6 months after Dad disappeared, then whatever is hidden inside was placed there during the renovation. Who did the electrical work?" Eleanor's face grew pale as the memory surfaced. "It was Billy Ray Hutchinson. He was a young electrician who had just started his own business. Very eager to please, worked long hours, often stayed after everyone else had gone home." She paused, her hand moving instinctively to the simple gold cross she wore around her neck. "Billy Ray was one of the people who helped search for your father. I remember thinking at the time how kind it was of him to volunteer his time for the search parties." Pastor Carmichael exchanged glances with Marcus Harrison. "Mrs. Hawthorne, do you think we should call the sheriff's department before we retrieve whatever is in that cavity?" "Yes," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "If this is connected to Matthew's disappearance, then it needs to be handled properly." Sheriff Amanda Beth Patterson arrived at Cornerstone Baptist Church 30 minutes later. At 52, Sheriff Patterson possessed the kind of calm competence that came from 28 years in law enforcement, including the last 8 as the elected sheriff of Williamson County. She had heard the story of Pastor Hawthorne's disappearance many times but had never expected to encounter physical evidence related to the case. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Sheriff Patterson said gently, "I want you to understand that we don't know what we're going to find in that wall. It could be completely unrelated to your husband's disappearance. Are you prepared for any possibility?" Eleanor nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "Sheriff, I've been waiting 40 years for answers. Whatever is in there, I need to know." With careful documentation and photographs, Marcus Harrison extracted the plastic-wrapped package from its hiding place. The bundle was approximately 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 6 inches thick, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting and sealed with duct tape that had yellowed with age. Sheriff Patterson examined the package without opening it, noting the way it had been wrapped and the style of tape used. "This packaging is consistent with materials available in the early 1980s, she observed. "The tape has aged significantly, which suggests it's been here for decades." "Should we open it here?" Pastor Carmichael asked. "I think it would be better to take it to the sheriff's department," Sheriff Patterson replied. "We have better facilities for evidence preservation, and if this is connected to Pastor Hawthorne's disappearance, we want to maintain proper chain of custody." Eleanor rode to the sheriff's department with David, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and dread. After 40 years of questions, was she finally about to learn the truth about Matthew's fate? At the sheriff's department, the package was carefully unwrapped under controlled conditions, with Sheriff Patterson documenting each step with photographs and detailed notes. As the plastic fell away, the contents became visible: a manila envelope, several photographs, and what appeared to be a small leather journal. The manila envelope bore a single word written in familiar handwriting: Eleanor. Sheriff Patterson looked at the elderly woman with compassion. "Mrs. Hawthorne, this appears to be addressed to you. Would you like to open it, or would you prefer that we do it?" "I'll open it," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. With trembling fingers, she carefully lifted the flap of the envelope and removed several sheets of paper covered in Matthew's distinctive handwriting. "My beloved Eleanor," the letter began, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she heard her husband's voice speaking to her across 4 decades of silence. "My beloved Eleanor. If you are reading this letter, then God has allowed the truth to come to light, just as His word promises. I pray that you will read these words with understanding and forgiveness, knowing that every decision I made was guided by love for you, for our children, and for the people of Cornerstone Baptist Church. 3 weeks ago, I learned something that has shaken me to my very foundation. Billy Ray Hutchinson, the young electrician who has been helping with various projects around the church, came to me in great distress. He confessed that he has been stealing money from local businesses, including funds he was paid in advance for electrical work he never completed. More troubling still, he admitted to breaking into homes to steal items he could sell to support his growing addiction to illegal drugs. Eleanor, I watched this young man weep as he told me about the desperation that had driven him to these crimes. He begged me to help him find a way to make restitution and get the help he needed. I agreed to counsel him and work with him toward confession and redemption, but I insisted that he must turn himself in to the authorities within 1 week. Billy Ray seemed grateful for my willingness to help, but as the week progressed, I began to see a darkness in him that frightened me. When I reminded him of his promise to confess, he became angry and threatening. He told me that if I revealed his crimes to anyone, he would kill me and harm our family. Eleanor, I have never seen such evil in a person's eyes. I cannot live with this knowledge, but I also cannot put you and the children in danger. Billy Ray watches our house, follows me when I leave the church, and has made it clear that he considers me a threat to his freedom. I have been praying for guidance, and I believe God is calling me to confront this evil directly, even if it costs me my life. I am writing this letter and gathering evidence of Billy Ray's crimes in the hope that someday, when it is safe, the truth will be revealed. I have photographs of stolen items in Billy Ray's possession, copies of checks he has forged, and documentation of money he has stolen from church members who trusted him with advance payments. Eleanor, if something happens to me, please know that I love you beyond words. Raise our children to know that their father chose to stand for truth and justice, even when it meant facing danger. Do not seek revenge against Billy Ray Hutchinson, but pray for his soul and trust that God's justice will prevail. I am hiding this letter and evidence in a place where Billy Ray will never think to look, in the very wall where he is installing new electrical wiring. God has a sense of irony that sometimes leaves me in awe. Until we meet again in glory, know that you are loved. Your devoted husband, Matthew Thomas Hawthorne. September 14, 1983 *. Eleanor read the letter twice before the words fully penetrated her consciousness. Her husband hadn't abandoned them or suffered an accident, he had been murdered by someone they had trusted, someone who had helped search for him while knowing exactly what had happened. Sheriff Patterson read the letter over Eleanor's shoulder, her expression growing grimmer with each paragraph. Mrs. Hawthorne, this letter provides clear evidence that Billy Ray Hutchinson was involved in your husband's disappearance. We need to locate Mr. Hutchinson immediately. Is he still alive? David asked, his voice tight with emotion. Sheriff Patterson was already on her radio, calling for information about Billy Ray Hutchinson's current whereabouts. Within minutes, she had an answer that made her jaw clench with frustration. Billy Ray Hutchinson died of a drug overdose in Memphis in 1997, she reported. He's been dead for 26 years. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of justice delayed and opportunities lost. Eleanor closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for strength to forgive a man who had destroyed her family and taken her husband's life. Sheriff, David said finally, what about the other evidence Dad mentioned? The photographs and documentation? Sheriff Patterson carefully examined the remaining contents of the package. There were indeed photographs showing stolen electronics and jewelry in what appeared to be Billy Ray's apartment, along with photocopies of forged checks and a list of church members who had paid him for work he never completed. Your father was building a criminal case against Hutchinson, Sheriff Patterson observed. These documents and photographs would have been enough to convict him of multiple felonies. It's clear why Hutchinson felt threatened enough to commit murder. Eleanor looked at the evidence her husband had gathered, seeing the careful way he had documented everything. Even facing death, Matthew had been thinking like a pastor, trying to protect his congregation from further victimization. Sheriff, Eleanor said quietly, what happens now? Billy Ray is dead, so there can't be a trial. But I want people to know what really happened to Matthew. I want his name cleared of any suspicion that he abandoned his family. We'll prepare a full report that closes the case officially, Sheriff Patterson assured her. The evidence is clear and convincing. Pastor Hawthorne was murdered by Billy Ray Hutchinson on September 14, 1983, after he threatened to expose Hutchinson's criminal activities. The case will be closed as solved, with the perpetrator deceased. As they prepared to leave the sheriff's department, Eleanor held Matthew's letter against her heart and thought about the final sermon he had preached on the night he disappeared. He had spoken about truth emerging from darkness, about God's perfect timing, about trusting in divine justice even when earthly circumstances seemed hopeless. 40 years later, his words had proven prophetic. The truth had indeed come to light, exactly as Matthew had promised it would. The news of Pastor Matthew Hawthorne's fate spread through Willowbrook Springs like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Within hours of the discovery at Cornerstone Baptist Church, the truth that had been hidden for 40 years was known throughout the community. The revelation brought a complex mixture of closure and renewed grief to a town that had never fully healed from the mystery of their beloved pastor's disappearance. Eleanor Hawthorne sat in her living room on Maple Street that evening, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Sarah, now 59 and an accomplished music teacher, had driven down from Nashville with her husband and teenage daughter. David had brought his wife and 2 sons, creating a house full of family members who were all struggling to process the day's revelations. "Grandmama," asked 16-year-old Rebecca, Sarah's daughter, "are you okay? I mean, finding out what really happened to Grandpa after all these years." Eleanor reached for her granddaughter's hand, drawing comfort from the young woman's concern. "I'm sad, honey, but I'm also relieved. For 40 years, I've wondered if your grandfather left us voluntarily, if he had somehow lost his faith or his love for our family. Now I know that none of those terrible thoughts were true. He died protecting people he cared about, just as Jesus died protecting all of us. Rebecca had grown up hearing stories about the grandfather she'd never met, but the dramatic discovery of his final message made Matthew Hawthorne feel more real to her than ever before. Will there be a funeral now? We still don't know where his body is, David explained gently. Billy Ray Hutchinson took that secret to his grave. But Mom is planning a memorial service to honor Dad's memory and share the truth about what happened. Eleanor nodded, her mind already turning to the task of planning a service that would celebrate Matthew's life while acknowledging the tragic circumstances of his death. I want people to understand that your grandfather's faith never wavered, even when he faced evil. That's the legacy I want to preserve. Across town, Pastor Jonathan Carmichael was dealing with his own complex emotions about the day's discoveries. He had served Cornerstone Baptist Church for 8 years, preaching from the same pulpit where Matthew Hawthorne had delivered his final sermon. The knowledge that evil had lurked so close to the sacred space he cherished was deeply disturbing. Jonathan, his wife Angela said as they sat together in their kitchen, "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world. This isn't your fault, you know." Pastor Carmichael sighed, running his hands through his hair. "I know that intellectually, Angela. But I keep thinking about how Billy Ray Hutchinson fooled everyone. He helped search for Pastor Hawthorne, knowing he had murdered the man. He worked in the church for months afterward, installing the wiring that hid the evidence of his crime. How does someone fake that level of deception?" "Evil is very good at wearing masks," Angela replied. "That's why Scripture warns us to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves." Pastor Hawthorne wasn't naive. He tried to help Billy Ray find redemption. But some people choose darkness over light, no matter what opportunities they're given. The renovation work at Cornerstone Baptist Church was temporarily suspended while the sheriff's department completed their investigation of the crime scene. Marcus Harrison and his crew treated the church building with even greater reverence than before, knowing that it had harbored both great evil and ultimate justice. "It's strange," Marcus told his brother Luke as they secured the construction site for the night. "That wall cavity was created to hide evidence of a crime, but it ended up preserving the truth until the right time came for it to be revealed. It's like God used Billy Ray's own deception against him." Luke nodded thoughtfully. "Makes you think about divine justice, doesn't it? Billy Ray thought he was clever, hiding that evidence where no one would find it. But God saw everything, and when the time was right, he made sure the truth came to light." Sheriff Patterson worked late into the night, compiling a comprehensive report that would officially close the case of Pastor Matthew Hawthorne's disappearance. The evidence was overwhelming and conclusive, painting a clear picture of what had happened on that September night in 1983. According to the documentation Matthew had gathered, Billy Ray Hutchinson had been running an elaborate scheme, taking advance payments for electrical work from businesses and homeowners throughout the county, then disappearing without completing the jobs. He had also been breaking into homes to steal items he could sell to support his drug addiction. When Pastor Hawthorne confronted him and demanded that he confess and make restitution, Billy Ray had chosen murder over accountability. The sheriff's investigation revealed that Billy Ray had likely killed Matthew somewhere near the creek behind the church, the place where Matthew often went to pray, and then disposed of the body in a location that had never been discovered. The proximity to water would have given Billy Ray multiple options for concealing the crime. The tragic irony, Sheriff Patterson noted in her report, is that Pastor Hawthorne was trying to save Billy Ray's soul when Billy Ray decided to destroy his life. This case demonstrates both the heights of human compassion and the depths of human depravity. 3 days after the discovery, Eleanor received a phone call that she had been both hoping for and dreading. Sheriff Patterson had located additional information about Billy Ray Hutchinson's activities in the weeks following Matthew's disappearance. "Mrs. Hawthorne," the sheriff said, "we've been in contact with law enforcement agencies in Memphis, where Billy Ray moved after leaving Willowbrook Springs. According to their records, he was arrested multiple times for drug possession and theft during the 1980s and 1990s. In 1995, during a drug rehabilitation program, he apparently made some kind of confession to a counselor about a serious crime he had committed in Tennessee. Eleanor's heart raced. Did he say anything specific about Matthew? The counselor's notes indicate that Billy Ray talked about killing a pastor who had threatened to expose his criminal activities. The counselor reported it to police, but by the time they followed up, Billy Ray had disappeared from the program. He was found dead of an overdose 2 years later. The knowledge that Billy Ray had eventually confessed, even if not to proper authorities, provided Eleanor with an additional measure of closure. Evil had not ultimately triumphed, even in the heart of the man who had destroyed her family. In his final years, guilt and perhaps the stirring of conscience had driven Billy Ray to acknowledge his crime. "Sheriff," Eleanor said, "I want to know if there's any way to locate Matthew's remains. I understand it's been 40 years, but—" "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Hawthorne," Sheriff Patterson replied. "The chances of finding your husband's body after 4 decades are very slim. But we're going to try. We have cadaver dogs coming in next week to search the woods around the church and along the creek. If there's anything to find, we'll find it." The search for Matthew's remains began the following Monday, with teams of investigators and specially trained dogs combing every inch of the wooded area behind Cornerstone Baptist Church. Eleanor chose not to watch the search, instead spending her time at home with family members who had come to support her during this difficult period. After 3 days of intensive searching, the team made a discovery that brought both closure and fresh heartbreak. In a secluded area about half a mile from the church, near a bend in the creek where the water ran deep and swift, the cadaver dogs detected human remains buried beneath 40 years of accumulated forest debris. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Sheriff Patterson said gently as she called with the news, "we found him. We found your husband." The remains were carefully excavated and sent for forensic analysis, though identification was largely a formality given the circumstances and location of the discovery. After 4 decades, Pastor Matthew Thomas Hawthorne was finally coming home. Eleanor sat in her garden that evening, watching the sun set behind the hills that surrounded Willowbrook Springs. The news that Matthew's body had been found should have brought her peace, but instead she felt the fresh ache of loss, as if he had died just yesterday instead of 40 years ago. "Mom." David found her there as darkness began to fall. "How are you holding up?" "I'm thinking about forgiveness," Eleanor replied quietly. "Your father wrote in his letter that I shouldn't seek revenge against Billy Ray, but should pray for his soul. I've been angry for 3 days, David. Angry at a dead man who destroyed our family. But tonight I realized that carrying that anger will only give Billy Ray another victory over us." David sat beside his mother on the garden bench that Matthew had built shortly before his disappearance. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to forgive him," Eleanor said simply. "Not because he deserves it, but because your father would want me to. And because I refuse to let hatred poison the rest of my life." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in that vast expanse, Eleanor believed, Matthew was watching over them, finally at peace. The memorial service for Pastor Matthew Hawthorne was held on a perfect October morning, exactly 40 years and 1 month after his disappearance. Cornerstone Baptist Church was filled to capacity, with additional seating set up in the fellowship hall and the service broadcast live on the church's website for those who couldn't attend in person. Pastor Carmichael opened the service with a reading from Romans 8 verse 28, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." "Today we gather not just to mourn the loss of a good man," Pastor Carmichael said, "but to celebrate the triumph of truth over deception, light over darkness, and love over evil." Pastor Matthew Hawthorne's final act on earth was an attempt to save the soul of the man who would kill him. In that act, we see the very heart of Christ reflected in his faithful servant. Eleanor spoke about the husband and father she had loved, sharing memories that painted a picture of a man whose faith had been tested by fire and found genuine. She read excerpts from Matthew's final letter, particularly his instructions about forgiveness and his trust in God's ultimate justice. Matthew believed that truth would emerge from darkness, Eleanor told the congregation. Today we see that his faith was justified. Evil may triumph for a season, but God's justice is eternal. Sarah played several of her father's favorite hymns on the piano, her skilled fingers drawing hauntingly beautiful melodies from the instrument. When she played Amazing Grace, there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. David spoke about the legacy his father had left, not just in the lives he had touched during his ministry, but in the example he had set of courage in the face of evil. Dad could have kept silent about Billy Ray's crimes, David said. It would have been safer for him and for our family. But he couldn't stand by and watch innocent people be victimized. He chose to do what was right, even when it cost him everything. The service concluded with the entire congregation singing, "When We All Get to Heaven," a hymn that Matthew had frequently requested during his ministry. As the final notes faded, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't experienced in 40 years. Matthew was finally at rest, and the truth that had been buried with him had come to light at last. Following the service, Matthew's newly discovered remains were interred in Willowbrook Springs Cemetery, in a plot next to the space that Eleanor had reserved for herself. The headstone, carved from beautiful Tennessee marble, bore a simple inscription. Reverend Matthew Thomas Hawthorne 1941–1983, "The truth will make you free," John 8 verse 32. As mourners gathered around the gravesite for the committal service, a flock of white doves was released into the clear blue sky, a symbol of the soul's flight to eternal rest and the truth that had finally been set free. In the weeks that followed, life in Willowbrook Springs began to settle into a new rhythm. The renovation of Cornerstone Baptist Church continued, with Marcus Harrison and his crew approaching their work with renewed reverence for the sacred space they were modernizing. The wall where the evidence had been hidden was preserved as part of the church's historical record, with a small plaque commemorating the discovery that had brought truth to light. Eleanor continued to live in her house on Maple Street, but now with a peace that had eluded her for 4 decades. She resumed her volunteer work at the elementary school and her duties as church pianist, finding joy in serving others as Matthew had taught her to do. Billy Ray Hutchinson's surviving family members, when contacted by reporters interested in the story, expressed profound shame and sorrow for their relatives' crimes. His elderly sister issued a public statement apologizing to the Hawthorne family and asking for forgiveness on behalf of her deceased brother. "We never knew what Billy Ray had done," the statement read. "If we had known, we would have insisted that he confess and face the consequences of his actions. We are deeply sorry for the pain he caused to Pastor Hawthorne's family and to the entire community of Willowbrook Springs." The story of Pastor Matthew Hawthorne's disappearance and the eventual discovery of the truth captured national attention, with news outlets across the country reporting on the case that had remained unsolved for 40 years. Several documentary filmmakers approached Eleanor about telling Matthew's story, but she declined most requests, preferring to let his life speak for itself through the people he had touched. However, she did agree to one project, a book written by a Christian author who wanted to explore themes of faith, justice, and forgiveness through Matthew's story. The book, titled Hidden Truth, A Pastor's Ultimate Sacrifice, became a bestseller and introduced Matthew's legacy to thousands of readers who were inspired by his courage and faith. On the first anniversary of the discovery of Matthew's letter, Cornerstone Baptist Church dedicated a new prayer garden on the site where his remains had been found. The garden featured native Tennessee plants, walking paths, and benches where people could come to pray and reflect. At the center of the garden stood a simple cross made from wood taken from the church's original pulpit, the same pulpit where Matthew had preached his final sermon. Eleanor often visited the prayer garden in the early morning hours, when the dew still sparkled on the flowers and the only sound was the gentle murmur of the creek that had witnessed Matthew's final moments. She would sit on the bench closest to the cross and pray for the continued healing of her family and community. "Matthew," she would whisper to the morning air, "your work is finished, and you've come home at last. Thank you for teaching me that love is stronger than death, truth is more powerful than deception, and God's justice, though sometimes delayed, is never denied." As the seasons turned and years passed, the story of Pastor Matthew Hawthorne became woven into the fabric of Willowbrook Springs' identity. Children learned about the pastor who had sacrificed his life to protect others from evil. Young people drew inspiration from his example of moral courage. Adults found comfort in the knowledge that truth would ultimately prevail, no matter how long it remained hidden. Eleanor Hawthorne lived to see her great-grandchildren grow up hearing stories about their brave ancestor. She passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 85, surrounded by family and friends who had been touched by her example of faith, forgiveness, and perseverance. At her funeral, Pastor Carmichael spoke about the legacy she and Matthew had left together, a legacy that proved the power of love to overcome hatred, truth to conquer deception, and faith to endure even the darkest trials. Eleanor and Matthew Hawthorne showed us, he said, that God can use even the most tragic circumstances to accomplish His purposes. Their story reminds us that we serve a God who sees in the darkness, who remembers the forgotten, and who ensures that justice, though delayed, will ultimately prevail. Today, visitors to Willowbrook Springs can see the memorial prayer garden where Pastor Matthew Hawthorne's body was discovered, read the historical marker that tells his story, and visit Cornerstone Baptist Church, where a small museum preserves artifacts from his ministry and documents the discovery that brought truth to light after 40 years of darkness. The story of Pastor Matthew Hawthorne serves as a powerful reminder that no secret can remain hidden forever when God is the keeper of truth. His final message, concealed for 4 decades in the very walls of the church where he had faithfully served, proves that love never fails, truth never dies, and justice, though sometimes long delayed, is never ultimately denied. In a world where evil often seems to triumph and good people sometimes pay terrible prices for their courage, the story of Matthew and Eleanor Hawthorne offers hope. It reminds us that God is always watching, always working, and always faithful to bring light into darkness when the time is right. The cross in the prayer garden still stands today, weathered by time but unbroken by the elements, a testament to the enduring power of faith and the certainty that truth, like love, is eternal. And on quiet mornings, when the mist rises from the creek and the sun filters through the ancient oak trees, visitors say they can almost hear the gentle voice of Pastor Matthew Hawthorne, still teaching the same lesson he preached in his final sermon. God's timing is perfect, truth will emerge from darkness, and those who trust in the Lord will never be put to shame. The day the pastor disappeared, he left behind more than just a mystery. He left behind a message of hope that would echo through the generations, proving that even death cannot silence the voice of truth, and even the grave cannot contain the power of love. His last message, hidden for 40 years, had finally come to light, just as he had always promised it would.